Adrian's hands trembled as he counted the bills. Not from the weight of the cash, but from the electric charge that shot through him every time Sebastian walked past his station. 3 months of stolen glances across the marble floors of First National Bank had turned into something he could no longer ignore. Something that made his chest ache every morning when he knotted his tie. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as their eyes met again, and this time, Sebastian didn't look away. The bank smelled like old money and new ambition, a mixture of leather portfolios and fresh coffee from the break room that never quite masked the underlying scent of anxiety that permeated every transaction. Adrian had worked there for 2 years, climbing from junior teller to senior accounts manager, his life a predictable rhythm of spreadsheets and client meetings that left him hollow at the end of each day. Then Sebastian transferred from the downtown branch, all sharp jawline and careful smiles. And suddenly Adrian understood what all those love songs had been trying to say. Sebastian was everything. Adrian had learned to suppress confidence without arrogance, warm without being unprofessional, the kind of man who remembered everyone's coffee order and still managed to close more deals than anyone else in the building. He wore his suits like armor, charcoal gray and navy blue. But there was something soft in the way he laughed at terrible jokes during team meetings. Adrian found himself volunteering for projects he didn't need, just to be in the same conference room, just to watch the way Sebastian's fingers moved across his tablet screen. It happened during the lunch rush on a Tuesday, when Sebastian slipped a folded note into Adrian's hand while pretending to ask about exchange rates. Rooftop, 5 p.m. I can't stop thinking about you. It read in hurried script that made Adrian's heart hammer against his ribs. He burned the note in the men's room sink and watched his future reshape itself in the curling smoke, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. The rooftop was empty except for old ventilation units and the golden light of early evening painting the city in amber. Sebastian was already there, his pressed shirt catching the breeze. And when Adrian stepped close enough to see the fear and hope warring in his eyes, words became unnecessary. Their first kiss tasted like coffee and courage, desperate and gentle, all at once. 2 men finally surrendering to what had been building between them like a storm. I've been losing my mind, Sebastian whispered against Adrian's mouth, his hands fisted in Adrian's shirt, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. The city stretched out below, indifferent to their revolution, while Adrian memorized the feeling of Sebastian's lips, the way his breath hitched when Adrian's fingers found the back of his neck. They stayed until the sun bled into the horizon, talking about everything and nothing, their bodies speaking a language their mouths were still learning. After that, they became experts in stolen moments, lingering touches when passing files, text messages deleted as soon as they were read, lunch breaks that ran too long because they couldn't stop talking. Adrian learned that Sebastian took his coffee black, that he'd moved to the city to escape a small town that would never understand him, that he dreamed of opening his own financial consulting firm someday. Sebastian discovered that Adrian painted in his spare time, that he'd nearly become a teacher before his parents convinced him banking was more practical, that he'd never let himself want someone this much before. The danger of it made everything sharper, more vivid, every accidental brush of fingers across a desk, every knowing look across a crowded conference room. They were careful, so careful, maintaining their professional distance during business hours, even as the tension between them built like electricity before a storm. Adrian would catch himself staring at Sebastian's hands during presentations, remembering how those fingers had traced patterns on his skin the night before, and have to force his attention back to quarterly reports. Their first real date happened on a Friday night, Sebastian picking Adrian up in his silver sedan, driving to a restaurant 2 towns over where no one from the bank would see them. They sat across from each other in a booth tucked in the back, the candlelight making Sebastian's eyes look almost gold, and talked until the waitstaff started stacking chairs. Adrian told stories about his college years, the art classes he'd abandoned, the version of himself he'd buried to become who his family expected. Sebastian reached across the table, his fingers finding Adrian's, and said, "I see you. The real you." His thumb traced circles on Adrian's palm, sending shivers up his arm, making it hard to breathe around the sudden fullness in his chest. They drove back to Sebastian's apartment in charged silence, the city lights blurring past the windows, both of them knowing what came next, but taking their time anyway. Sebastian's apartment was all clean lines and minimal furniture, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine, except for the stack of financial journals on the coffee table and the guitar gathering dust in the corner. They barely made it through the door before they were kissing again. Sebastian's back against the wall, Adrian's hands in his hair, months of wanting finally finding release. Clothes fell away like confessions, each piece revealing more truth, more vulnerability, until they were skin to skin and trembling with it. The bedroom was dark, except for the ambient light from the street, painting them in shadows and silver as they fell onto the bed together. Sebastian pulled Adrian close, his hands mapping territory he'd only imagined, learning the landscape of muscle and bone, the places that made Adrian gasp. They moved together slowly at first, savoring each discovery, the slide of skin on skin, the taste of salt and heat, building toward something that felt like coming home when they came together completely. Adrian buried his face in Sebastian's neck, overwhelmed by the intimacy of it, the way Sebastian's body opened for him, trusting and eager and perfect. They moved in rhythm, finding their pace. Sebastian's fingers digging into Adrian's shoulders, his breath coming in broken gasps that drove Adrian higher. The world narrowed to this, the flex and release of muscle, the slick heat between them, the way Sebastian said his name like a prayer. Afterward, they lay tangled together, sweat cooling on their skin, hearts still racing as reality slowly filtered back in. Sebastian traced idle patterns on Adrian's chest, his voice rough when he said, "I knew it would be like this." Adrian kissed his temple, tasting salt, feeling the weight of what they'd just done, settling over them like a blanket. They'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross, and neither of them wanted to go back. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in discretion and desire. They learned to maintain their professional facades while conducting a secret relationship that grew deeper with each passing day. Mornings started with rushed kisses in Sebastian's apartment before they drove to work separately, arriving at staggered times to avoid suspicion. Lunch breaks became strategic operations, meeting in Sebastian's car in the far corner of the parking garage. Stolen half hours where they could drop the pretense and just be themselves. Adrian found himself living to life's the buttoned-up banker who analyzed risk portfolios and smiled blandly at client meetings, and the man who came alive in Sebastian's arms, who laughed freely and loved without reservation. The dichotomy was exhausting but necessary, a small price to pay for what they'd found. Sebastian seemed to thrive on the secrecy, his eyes finding Adrian across the office with a heat that made concentration impossible. They developed codes, subtle signals invisible to everyone else but blazing clear between them. Sebastian adjusting his tie meant he was thinking about last night. Adrian touching his watch meant he wanted Sebastian now. A particular smile meant "I love you," even though they hadn't said the words out loud yet. The bank became a stage where they performed normalcy while conducting an entire conversation in glances and gestures. But desire has a way of making people reckless. And 3 months in, they started taking bigger risks. It began innocently enough. Sebastian following Adrian into the storage room on the 3rd floor, supposedly to retrieve archived files, but really to steal a few minutes alone. The kiss was fierce and quick, Sebastian pressing Adrian against the metal shelves, his hand sliding under Adrian's shirt to find warm skin. Both of them breathing hard when they finally pulled apart. "We can't keep doing this here," Adrian said, even as his body argued otherwise. already missing Sebastian's touch. Sebastian grinned, that dangerous smile that had started all of this, and replied, "Then stop being so irresistible." They left the storage room separately, files in hand, their professional masks firmly back in place. But Adrian could feel the heat of it, following him back to his desk. The conference room on the 5th floor became their favorite spot for quick, stolen moments during late afternoons when most people had gone home. They'd schedule fake meetings, lock the door, and give themselves over to frantic kisses and wandering hands, never quite going far enough to truly compromise themselves, but pushing the boundaries further each time. Adrian would leave with his shirt wrinkled, his lips swollen, his mind foggy with want, somehow expected to finish expense reports while remembering how Sebastian's tongue had felt against his neck. They got bolder, meeting in empty offices after hours. Sebastian spreading paperwork across his desk and bending Adrian over it, their encounters becoming more heated, more desperate. The thrill of possibly being caught added an edge to everything, made every touch feel more urgent. Adrian knew they were playing with fire, but he couldn't stop. Couldn't deny himself the rush of Sebastian's hands on his body. The sound of his name gasped in the dark. The security cameras were something they should have thought about. But lust and love have a way of making people forget practical concerns, like digital surveillance and corporate oversight. They'd been so careful about people, about maintaining distance in public spaces, that they'd completely overlooked the electronic eyes watching from ceiling corners. The cameras in the hallways, the lobby, the conference rooms, they'd become part of the background, so omnipresent they were invisible. It was a Wednesday when Adrian's supervisor called him into her office, her expression carefully neutral, but her posture tense. Margaret Chen had been with the bank for 15 years, had mentored Adrian through his early career, and the disappointment in her eyes hit him like a physical blow before she even spoke. She closed the door, gestured for him to sit, and pulled up security footage on her computer screen. The video was damning, grainy black and white footage of him and Sebastian in the 3rd floor conference room, their bodies pressed together, hands visible under clothing, the clear intent obvious, even without sound. Adrian's stomach dropped, his face going hot, then cold, as he watched himself on screen. Watched the careful pretense they'd maintained shatter in high definition. Margaret paused the video, her finger hovering over the mouse, and asked quietly, "How long has this been going on?" Adrian's mouth was dry, his carefully constructed life crumbling in real time, as he struggled to find words that wouldn't make it worse. 4 months, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, unable to look away from the frozen image on screen. Margaret sighed, a sound heavy with resignation, and said what Adrian already knew was coming. They'd violated company policy, created liability issues, and there were consequences that couldn't be avoided. Sebastian was already in the HR director's office when Adrian was escorted down the hall, their eyes meeting briefly before security separated them. The termination process was swift and brutal. Immediate dismissal. Severance packages contingent on signing non-disclosure agreements. Their personal belongings boxed up and ready before they could protest. Adrian signed the papers with numb fingers, his mind replaying the footage over and over, unable to reconcile his private joy with this public humiliation. They weren't allowed to speak to each other, weren't given a chance to coordinate or comfort, just marched out separately through the lobby, while their former colleagues pretended not to stare. Adrian's box of desk items felt impossibly heavy. Framed photos, a coffee mug, the small succulent he'd been keeping alive for 2 years, each object a reminder of the life he'd just lost. The security guard who escorted him out was polite but firm, holding the door open with practiced indifference. The parking garage was almost empty in the middle of the afternoon, Adrian's footsteps echoing as he walked to his car, his hands shaking so badly he dropped his keys twice before getting the door unlocked. He sat in the driver's seat for 15 minutes, staring at nothing, trying to process what had just happened. His career, his reputation, his financial stability, all of it gone, because he'd been unable to keep his hands to himself, because he'd let desire override common sense. His phone buzzed with a text from Sebastian. "My apartment, please." Adrian drove through the city on autopilot, his mind spinning through worst-case scenarios. How would he explain this to his parents? How long before word spread through the industry, whether he'd ever work in finance again? The shame was suffocating, made worse by the knowledge that he'd brought this on himself, that he'd known the risks and taken them anyway. Sebastian answered the door, looking wrecked. His tie loosened, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it, and the sight of him broke something open in Adrian's chest. They stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at each other, before Sebastian pulled him inside and into his arms. Adrian collapsed against him, the full weight of the day finally hitting. His carefully maintained composure shattering as Sebastian held him together. "I'm so sorry," Sebastian said into Adrian's hair, his voice rough with emotion, his hands tight on Adrian's back. Adrian shook his head, pulling back enough to see Sebastian's face, the guilt and fear written plainly there. "We did this together," Adrian replied, because blame was useless now, because they'd made their choices, knowing the consequences even if they hadn't truly believed they'd face them. They spent that night on Sebastian's couch, drinking whiskey neither of them really wanted, trying to make sense of what came next. The practical concerns loomed: large bills that still needed paying, references they no longer had, the professional network they'd just been ejected from. Sebastian's lease was month to month. Adrian's apartment had 3 months left on the contract. Their savings would last a while, but not forever. They made lists, trying to impose order on chaos. Two men who'd built careers on risk assessment, now facing the biggest gamble of their lives. But underneath the fear and uncertainty was something else, a strange sense of freedom, of possibility. "Maybe this is the universe telling us something," Sebastian said, reaching for Adrian's hand, threading their fingers together. Adrian looked at their joined hands, thought about the security footage, the walk of shame through the lobby, and felt an unexpected laugh bubble up. "If this is the universe talking, it has a terrible sense of timing," he replied. But he squeezed Sebastian's hand back, holding on like a lifeline. They stayed up until dawn, talking through options and contingencies, their professional training finally useful for something other than quarterly reports. Sebastian mentioned his old dream of independent consulting. Adrian talked about teaching positions he'd looked at years ago, both of them dancing around the obvious question: were they doing this together? Or would the disaster of their firing tear them apart? The answer felt obvious but terrifying, a commitment neither of them had planned to make this soon. "I love you," Sebastian said as the sun started to paint the sky pink, the words hanging in the air between them like a dare. Adrian's heart stuttered, even though he'd known, even though he'd felt it in every touch and glance for months. "I love you too," he replied, and it felt like signing a contract, like making promises he intended to keep no matter how hard the road ahead became. The next few weeks were brutal, sending out resumes that went unanswered, phone calls that went unreturned once potential employers checked references and got vague, non-committal responses from First National Bank. The whisper network in finance was efficient and merciless, and soon Adrian and Sebastian were effectively blacklisted from traditional banking positions. Adrian burned through his savings faster than expected, stress eating at cheap takeout while sending out application after application, each rejection another weight on his shoulders. Sebastian handled it better, or at least hid it better, his optimism sometimes grating when Adrian was spiraling into despair. They fought, sharp words exchanged in small kitchens about money and responsibility and who was trying harder. Adrian accused Sebastian of not taking it seriously. Sebastian shot back that Adrian's defeatism was self-fulfilling, and they'd end up on opposite sides of the apartment, both stewing in resentment and fear, but they always came back together. Apologies whispered in the dark, bodies finding comfort even when words failed them. Sex became both escape and reconnection, a way to remember why they'd risked everything in the first place. Adrian would lose himself in the familiar geography of Sebastian's body. The sounds he made, the way he said Adrian's name when he was close. Afterward, tangled in sheets that smelled like both of them. The problems seemed more manageable, the future less bleak. Adrian took a job at a retail bank, a significant step down in prestige and pay, processing loans and opening savings accounts for customers who treated him like a service worker rather than a professional. It stung, wearing a polyester vest instead of tailored suits, answering to a manager 10 years younger, who clearly didn't understand Adrian's qualifications. But it paid the bills, kept them afloat while Sebastian worked on building his consulting business from nothing. Sebastian rented a tiny office space, just a desk and a filing cabinet, and a dream, cold calling potential clients and leveraging every contact he still had who'd take his calls. He worked 16-hour days, coming home exhausted, but energized, talking about clients and strategies and 5-year plans. Adrian listened, supportive, but skeptical. His own career disappointment making it hard to believe in Sebastian's vision. The tension between them was constant, born of stress and wounded pride, and the claustrophobia of sharing a one-bedroom apartment when both of them were used to more space. Sebastian was messy, leaving dishes in the sink and clothes on the floor. Small irritations that became major when Adrian was already stretched thin. Adrian was withdrawn, pulling into himself when things got hard, shutting Sebastian out emotionally even as they shared a bed every night. 6 months after the firing, they hit bottom. Adrian came home to find eviction notices on their door. Sebastian had been late on rent twice, prioritizing business expenses over their home, and the landlord's patience had run out. The fight that followed was nuclear, years of frustration and fear boiling over into accusations and recriminations. Adrian called Sebastian irresponsible. Sebastian called Adrian a coward, and they said things designed to wound, to hit where it hurt most. Sebastian left, slamming the door so hard the frame shook, leaving Adrian alone in the apartment they could no longer afford. Adrian sat on the floor, surrounded by moving boxes they'd never fully unpacked, and let himself cry for the first time since losing his job. He'd sacrificed everything for this relationship, his career, his reputation, his stability, and now he was losing that too. The love that had seemed worth any price now felt like the worst investment he'd ever made. He didn't hear from Sebastian for 3 days, the longest silence they'd had since meeting, and Adrian convinced himself it was over. He started looking for studio apartments he could afford on his retail salary, boxing up his things with mechanical efficiency, building walls around his heart to prepare for the inevitable end. When Sebastian finally showed up at 2 a.m. on the 3rd night, Adrian almost didn't answer the door. Sebastian looked terrible and shaven, rumpled, his eyes red-rimmed but burning with intensity. "I got a client," he said without preamble, pushing past Adrian into the apartment. "A real one, a corporate account, enough to cover the back rent, and next month too." He pulled out a contract, the paperwork proof of what he'd been working toward, and Adrian felt something crack open in his chest. "I'm sorry," they said simultaneously, the words tumbling over each other, both of them laughing despite everything. Sebastian crossed the space between them, cupping Adrian's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears. Adrian hadn't realized he was crying. "I can't do this without you," Sebastian said. And Adrian believed him, believed in them again, believed that maybe they could actually survive this. They made love that night, with desperate intensity, relearning each other's bodies like it was the first time. Every touch, a promise, and an apology. Sebastian took his time, kissing every inch of Adrian's skin, worshipping him with hands and mouth until Adrian was trembling with it. When they finally came together, It felt like a new beginning. Something fragile, but real being forged between them. The business grew slowly but steadily. Sebastian's one client leading to referrals. His reputation building through word of mouth. Adrian watched him transform. Watched the defeat of being fired turn into determination. Watched him become the man he was always meant to be. It was humbling and inspiring. Made Adrian reassess his own choices. His own relationship with failure and success. Adrian started painting again, something he hadn't done since college. Setting up an easel in the corner of their bedroom and losing himself in color and form. The paintings were dark at first, processing his anger and disappointment, but they slowly lightened, became more hopeful. Sebastian would come home from client meetings to find Adrian covered in paint, lost in creation. And the look on his face made Adrian feel seen in a way the banking world never had. They moved into a better apartment, still modest, but theirs, with enough space for Sebastian's home office and Adrian's art studio. The furniture was secondhand, the decorating haphazard, but it felt more like home than anywhere Adrian had lived before. They cooked dinner together, learned each other's rhythms, built a life that had nothing to do with corporate expectations or other people's definitions of success. Adrian eventually quit the retail bank, taking a chance on selling his paintings online, supplementing income with part-time teaching at a community art center. It was terrifying, giving up the security of a steady paycheck. But Sebastian encouraged him, believed in his talent even when Adrian didn't. The first painting sold for more than Adrian made in a week at the bank, and he cried when he saw the notification, overwhelmed by the possibility of it all. 2 years after being fired, Sebastian's consulting firm had a staff of 5 and a client list that would have made their old bosses jealous. He worked from a real office now, with a receptionist and conference rooms, and all the trappings of legitimacy. Adrian's paintings were featured in a small gallery downtown, modest success but as earned on his own terms. They'd built something neither of them could have imagined in that awful moment when security had escorted them out of First National Bank. They still worked hard, still fought sometimes about money and priorities and whose turn it was to do the dishes. But the foundation was solid now. They'd been tested by unemployment and humiliation and near eviction, and they'd come through it together. The love that had cost them their careers had become the thing that saved them, gave them the courage to rebuild as better versions of themselves. Sebastian proposed on the anniversary of their firing, a date they'd started celebrating as their real beginning, the day they'd lost everything and found each other. He did it in their apartment. No grand gestures or public displays, just the two of them and a simple band, and asked Adrian to marry him. Adrian said yes without hesitation, kissing Sebastian breathless, tasting the salt of happy tears. The wedding was small, just close friends and the family members who'd come around to accepting them, held in the gallery where Adrian's paintings hung on the walls. They wrote their own vows, promising to support each other's dreams. To be honest, even when it hurt, to never let fear keep them from living authentically. When they kissed as married men, Adrian felt the weight of the past fall away, replaced by the lightness of possibility. Their wedding night was tender and fierce, 3 years of history in every touch, every kiss, every whispered declaration. They made love slowly, savoring each sensation. The knowledge that they'd chosen this, chosen each other, despite and because of everything they'd been through. Sebastian moved inside him with reverent intensity, their bodies perfectly synced after years of practice, bringing each other to heights that felt new even in their familiarity. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. After that, Sebastian's business continued growing. Adrian's art career gained momentum, and they learned to navigate marriage with the same determination they'd brought to survival. They bought a house, adopted a dog, hosted dinner parties where they told the story of how they met with humor and honesty. The shame of being fired had transmuted into pride in what they'd built from the ashes. Adrian sometimes thought about the security footage, the evidence of their indiscretion that had cost them so much. In weaker moments, he still felt the sting of humiliation, the what-ifs and if-onlys that plagued late nights, but mostly he felt grateful for the push that had forced them to find their true paths, for the crisis that had proven their love was stronger than convenience. Sebastian's consulting firm eventually became successful enough to make headlines, a local business success story that attracted attention. A reporter interviewing him asked about his background, and Sebastian was honest about being fired, about the relationship that had started it all. The article ran with the headline "From Scandal to Success: How One Couple Built an Empire After Being Fired for Love," and Adrian braced for backlash that never came. Instead, they received messages from other couples who'd faced similar situations, LGBTQ+ professionals navigating workplace discrimination, people who saw their story as inspiration rather than cautionary tale. Adrian was shocked by the response, had thought of their journey as private survival, not public triumph. But Sebastian embraced it, started speaking at business conferences about authenticity and risk-taking, turning their story into advocacy. Adrian joined him sometimes, talking about creativity and second chances. His paintings displayed at events where he once would have been too ashamed to show his face. They became an odd kind of power couple, not the polished banking executives they'd once been, but something more real, more hard-won. The cameras that had once exposed them now captured them at charity events and ribbon cuttings. Their success, a middle finger to everyone who'd written them off. 5 years after the firing, they returned to First National Bank as clients. Sebastian's company needing commercial banking services they could no longer ignore. The irony wasn't lost on either of them as they walked through the marble lobby where they'd once stolen glances. Margaret Chen, Adrian's former supervisor, was still there, now a senior vice president, and she handled their account personally with professional courtesy that verged on apologetic. "You've done well for yourselves," she said during one meeting, her eyes taking in Sebastian's custom suit and Adrian's portfolio of recent sales. "I'm glad it worked out." Adrian wanted to be bitter, to remind her that she'd signed off on their terminations, but he found he couldn't hold the grudge. She'd done her job, and they'd done theirs, the job of building a life worth living, no matter the cost. They made love that night with extra intensity, celebrating in their bedroom how far they'd come from furtive encounters in conference rooms. Sebastian took control, the way he did when he wanted to remind Adrian who they'd become, pinning his wrists above his head and driving into him with purposeful strokes that left them both gasping. Adrian surrendered completely, trusting Sebastian with his body and heart in ways that still felt miraculous. The years continued to pass, bringing challenges and triumphs in equal measures. Sebastian's business weathered a recession. Adrian had a solo show in a major gallery. They navigated health scares and family dramas, and all the mundane difficulties of building a life together. Through it all, they held on to each other. The foundation they'd built on the ruins of their banking careers proving unshakable. On their 10th anniversary, they hosted a party that brought together their worlds: Sebastian's business associates, Adrian's art connections, friends they'd made in the years since starting over. The house was full of laughter and music, the yard strung with lights that made everything look magical. Adrian watched Sebastian work the crowd, charming and confident, and marveled at how far they'd both come. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had left, they found themselves alone in the kitchen doing dishes side by side. Sebastian's hand found Adrian's soapy one, squeezing gently, and they shared a look that contained everything they'd been through. "Would you do it again?" Sebastian asked, the question they'd danced around for years finally spoken aloud, knowing what it would cost. Adrian thought about the security footage, the unemployment, the fights and fears and moments when giving up seemed easier than pushing forward. He thought about the life they'd built, the freedom to create and love without hiding, the depth of partnership that came from surviving the worst together. Every single time, he answered, and knew it was true, would always be true. They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity and the passion of people who still chose each other every day. Sebastian worshipped Adrian's body like he was learning it for the first time. His touches reverent and hungry, bringing Adrian to the edge and back until he was begging. When they finally tumbled over together, it felt like coming home, like the safest place in the world was here in each other's arms. The business eventually grew large enough that Sebastian could step back, hire a management team to handle day-to-day operations while he focused on strategy and the relationships he'd always been best at. Adrian's paintings were now in permanent collections. His teaching job at the art center became a regular professorship at the university. They'd achieved success by conventional measures, but more importantly, they'd achieved happiness. They traveled, finally having the time and money to see the world, together Paris, and Tokyo, and Sydney, places they'd once only dreamed about while processing loan applications. In every city, they'd find the LGBTQ quarter, the queer bars and galleries, seeing reflections of themselves in communities around the world. It made them feel less alone, part of something bigger than their own small story. On a beach in Thailand, watching the sunset paint the water gold and crimson, Sebastian turned to Adrian and said, "Thank you for not giving up on us." Adrian kissed him, tasting salt spray and coconut sunscreen, feeling grateful beyond words for this man who'd loved him through the worst and celebrated with him through the best. "Never," he replied. "Not possible." They made love that night in their hotel room with the windows open to the ocean, the sounds of waves mixing with their gasps and moans. The years had taught them each other perfectly. Sebastian knew exactly how to touch Adrian to make him lose control. Adrian knew precisely what Sebastian needed to fall apart. They came together in a rush of sensation that left them both trembling, holding each other as their breathing slowly returned to normal. At 40, they were still discovering new things about each other, still growing individually and together. Adrian started a foundation to help young LGBTQ artists, using his success to create opportunities he hadn't had. Sebastian expanded into mentoring, taking on young queer professionals and helping them navigate career paths, without having to choose between authenticity and advancement. Their story had become a bridge for others to cross. The 20-year anniversary of their firing was marked with a champagne toast in their home office, surrounded by evidence of what they'd built. Sebastian's business awards, Adrian's gallery catalogs, photos from a life well lived. They'd invited their younger selves to see this, to know that the worst day of their professional lives had been the beginning of their best life. The security footage that had once been evidence of their downfall now felt like proof of their courage. They still worked in the same house, still stole moments throughout the day for kisses and touches, but now it was permitted, celebrated, their love no longer contraband. Adrian would bring Sebastian lunch in his office, stay for quickies that left them both disheveled and grinning. Sebastian would interrupt Adrian's painting sessions for slow, sensual encounters that made time disappear. Their desire for each other hadn't dimmed with familiarity, had only deepened with trust. Looking back, Adrian could see the pattern: how being fired had forced them to confront who they really were, what they actually wanted from life. The careers they'd lost had been building toward a future neither of them truly wanted. Success measured in promotions and bonuses that left them empty. The disaster had been a gift disguised as catastrophe, burning down the safe, predictable future to make room for something better. They'd tell people that getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to them, and it was true, even though it had nearly destroyed them. The pain had been necessary, the struggle had made them stronger, and they'd emerged on the other side as the people they were always meant to be. The love that had cost them everything had given them so much more in return. Now in their 50s, they'd become the couple younger queers looked up to, the proof that love could survive anything if you were willing to fight for it. They gave talks together sometimes, finishing each other's sentences, telling their story with humor and honesty. The security camera footage was long gone, but they didn't need it. The evidence of their love was everywhere. In the life they'd built, the people they'd become. Their story had no villain, just a system that couldn't accommodate their truth, and two men brave enough to burn it down rather than live a lie. They'd lost jobs but found purpose, lost reputation but gained authenticity, lost security but gained freedom. The trade-off had been worth it 1,000 times over, and they'd make the same choice again, without hesitation. As they grew older together, their love evolved, but never diminished. Less frantic perhaps, but deeper. The passion of youth replaced with the intimacy of true partnership. They knew each other's bodies better than their own, could read moods from across a room, finished thoughts without words. The romance hadn't died, it had matured, become something sustainable and profound. They made love less frequently, but more meaningfully. Each encounter a celebration of everything they'd survived and built together. Sebastian still made Adrian feel desired, still looked at him with hunger, even after decades together. Adrian still melted under Sebastian's touch, still got butterflies when Sebastian smiled at him across the dinner table. The fire had become a steady flame, warm and constant and utterly dependable. On their 30th wedding anniversary, they renewed their vows in the same gallery where they'd first married, surrounded by friends and family, and the artwork that chronicled their journey. They'd updated the promises to reflect who they'd become, but the core remained the same: to love each other fiercely, to support each other's dreams, to never let fear win. When they kissed, Adrian tasted their whole history, every triumph and disaster that had brought them to this moment. The reception was a celebration of not just their marriage, but their entire life. Together, a video montage showed them aging in reverse, photographs documenting 3 decades of love. There were pictures from their first date, their wedding, the opening of Sebastian's first office, Adrian's first gallery show. There were photos from travels and holidays, from quiet mornings and grand celebrations. A visual record of a life well lived and fully shared. That night, alone finally after hours of celebration, they came together with the tenderness of long practice and the intensity of still burning desire. Sebastian undressed Adrian slowly, his hands reverent on skin that had changed with time but remained infinitely precious. They made love like they had all the time in the world, because they did. Because they'd built a life that honored their love, rather than hiding it. Afterward, lying tangled together in sheets that smelled like home, Sebastian said, "I'd do it all again, you know, every moment." Adrian kissed his shoulder, his heart too full for words, understanding completely. The firing, the struggle, the fear and uncertainty, all of it had been necessary to get them here, to this bed in this house they'd built together. To this love that had survived everything thrown at it. Their story wasn't a fairy tale, it was better, because it was real. It was messy and painful and glorious, full of mistakes and grace, and the kind of love that only comes from choosing each other every single day. The security cameras had caught the beginning, but they'd written the rest themselves. Every chapter earned, every page proof that love could conquer, not just hate but fear, shame, and the crushing weight of other people's expectations. As they drifted toward sleep, Adrian thought about the younger version of himself trembling in the bank that first day, too afraid to even acknowledge what he felt. He wished he could tell that man what was coming: the pain and the joy, the falling and the rising, the love that would reshape his entire world. But mostly he'd tell him not to be afraid, that the risk was worth taking, that the life on the other side of disaster was better than anything he could imagine. Sebastian's breathing evened out into sleep, his arm heavy across Adrian's waist, and Adrian smiled into the darkness. They'd been fired for loving each other, and in response, they'd built a life that was nothing but love in their work, their home, their every interaction. The security footage had captured an ending, but it had also captured the beginning of everything that mattered. And they'd spent 30 years proving that sometimes the best revenge is living well, loving fiercely, and never, ever apologizing for who you are.